June 18, 1944, Central Texas, Camp Swift. The argument wasn't in German. It wasn't even between enemies. Two American farmers were shouting at each other, and they turned to a German POW to settle it. The sun pressed down without mercy, flattening the air until it felt thick enough to chew. Dust lifted from the dry ground with every step, clinging to boots, and cuffs coating skin with a fine grit that tasted like chalk. A split-rail fence ran crooked along the edge of the field, its posts bleached pale and splintered by years of heat. Cicadas screamed from the scrub, relentless and mechanical, as if the land itself were protesting the intrusion of men. The cotton plants stood knee-high and tired, their leaves dulled by drought, their white bowls just beginning to open. The smell was sharp and faintly sweet raw fiber and sunburned earth mixed with sweat. Men worked in silence nearby, heads down, hands moving in practiced rhythms. Among them was a German prisoner of war, his shirt darkened under the arms, his back stiff with habit rather than defiance. He had learned the rules quickly. Work when told. Keep your eyes low. Speak only when spoken to. America had surprised him with many things since his arrival. Food that came regularly, water that ran freely. Guards who shouted but did not strike, but he trusted none of it. Kindness, he believed, was simply another weapon. The shouting cut through the steady hum of insects. "You moved the damn line," one farmer barked, jabbing a finger toward the ditch that ran between their fields. His hat was pulled low, his jaw clenched tight enough to show the cords in his neck. "I didn't move a thing," the other shot back. "That's where it's always been. You just don't like losing a foot of land." The ditch in the question was little more than a shallow scar in the dirt dug years earlier to carry runoff after heavy rain. In wetter seasons, it mattered. In a summer like this, it had become a symbol of pride, of ownership, of the last scraps of certainty men could cling to while the world burned elsewhere. They circled each other, boots grinding into the dust. No one else intervened. Arguments like this were common now. With sons overseas and hired hands gone, farms were stretched thin. Every acre counted. Every foot of water mattered. Then, one of the farmers did something no one expected. He turned away from his opponent and looked toward the line of working prisoners. His gaze settled on the German. "Hey," he called out, not unkindly. "You, the one from the courthouse back home." The German froze. For a moment the cicadas seemed louder, the sun harsher. He did not look up right away. He was certain he had misunderstood. The word courthouse echoed in his head like a mistake. The farmer repeated himself slower this time. "They told me you used to be some kind of judge." The German lifted his eyes. Not all the way, just enough to see the two men watching him, waiting. No rifle was raised. No guard stepped forward. This was not an order. It was a request. His name was spoken, not barked. He heard it carried on the hot air, stripped of rank and insult. He stepped out of line on his own hands, hanging uselessly at his sides. In another life, he had worn a black robe. In another country, men had stood when he entered a room. Those memories felt unreal now, like stories borrowed from someone else. Here, he was a prisoner, enemy, labor. The two Americans explained their dispute in fragments, this post that bent in the ditch, a line drawn years before by a father now buried. Their voices rose and fell, frustration layered over exhaustion. The German listened without interrupting, his mind racing ahead of his body. Why would they do this? Why would men who were free men, whose country was winning, turn to an enemy for judgment? Across the ocean, the war was entering its bloodiest phase. Just 2 weeks earlier, Allied troops had stormed the beaches of Normandy. Newspapers arrived at the camp days late, but the headlines still carried weight. France was aflame again. Europe was cracking open. Millions were moving, armies, refugees, prisoners, pulled by forces too large to name. More than 12 million American men were overseas, now scattered across continents and oceans. Factories ran day and night. Trains groaned under the weight of tanks and grain. And here in rural Texas, farms like these were kept alive by women, old men, and the labor of captured enemies. The German knew all of this in pieces. He had watched the trains pass beyond the wire. He had seen the fields stretch farther than anything he remembered from home. America did not look like a nation at war. It looked like a nation holding its breath and somehow still feeding the world. The farmers finished speaking. They waited. No one laughed. No one mocked him. The silence grew heavy, filled with expectation. He felt his pulse in his throat. Every instinct told him this was a trap, that whatever he said would be used to shame him, that the moment he spoke the joke would be revealed and with it his place. An enemy does not judge Americans. An enemy is judged. He searched their faces for cruelty and found only impatience and something else, a stubborn belief that rules mattered even now, especially now. A stick lay near the fence, bleached and smooth. One of the men nudged it toward him with his boot. "Show us," he said. The German bent to pick it up. Dust smeared his fingers. As he straightened, the sun caught the sweat on his brow, and for a brief terrifying instant he felt visible in a way he had not been since before the war. The field, the fence, the ditch, everything waited. Somewhere behind him, other prisoners had stopped working. Guards watched from a distance, curious but unconcerned. The world did not pause. It leaned in. He thought of the robe folded away forever, of laws written and then broken, of a country that had taught him obedience before justice. His hand trembled around the stick. This was not what captivity was supposed to be. This was not how enemies behaved. As he stepped forward, drawing his first line in the dirt, one thought cut through all the others sharp and undeniable. He thought this was the moment they would humiliate him. I had learned to recognize moments of danger without anyone raising a hand. In Germany, danger had rarely announced itself with shouting. It arrived quietly through paperwork, through smiles that lingered too long, through requests that were not really requests. By the time voices were raised, the verdict had already been decided. That was why my first instinct standing between those two American farmers was not confusion. It was fear. Not the sharp fear of bombs or gunfire, the slower, heavier kind. The kind that settles in the stomach and tightens the throat. I had worn a robe once, black wool, heavy, formal. When I moved, it moved with me as if it were part of my body. In the courtroom, the sound of it brushing against the floor was enough to bring a room to order. Men stood. Voices softened. Words were chosen carefully. Law had weight then. It mattered how something was said, not just who said it. That world ended long before I crossed the Atlantic. First, the laws changed, quietly. Then the courts changed, quickly. And finally, the robe disappeared altogether. One signature, one decree, and I was no longer trusted to judge anyone. Not because I was corrupt. Not because I was incompetent. But because I believed law should restrain power, not serve it. When the war came, there was no place left for men like me. By the time I was captured, I was already accustomed to erasure. Name replaced by a number, profession reduced to a footnote. Authority stripped not by defeat, but by uniform. When they issued me prison clothes in America, I did not resist. Resistance requires belief that something remains to be defended. Still, nothing prepared me for this. 2 free men, 2 citizens of the country that held me behind wire. Arguing not about ideology or loyalty, but about a ditch. About where one man's land ended and another's began, and they wanted me to decide. Every lesson I had learned under the Reich screamed the same warning. This is theater. This is humiliation disguised as fairness. This is what victors do when they want to remind you who you are. We had been taught that America was chaos pretending to be order, that its laws were flexible, its morals shallow, that it hid cruelty behind smiles and process, that prisoners were not beaten immediately, but broken slowly publicly until obedience felt like relief. I had believed it, not because I wanted to, but because belief was safer than hope. On the transport ship, men whispered stories in the dark. Not facts, never facts. Stories of POWs forced to perform for crowds, of trials staged as entertainment, of enemies pretending to listen only to laugh once the victim spoke. So, when the farmer said he had heard I was a judge, my first thought was not pride. It was shame. They knew who I had been, which meant they also knew who I was now, a fallen man dressed in canvas working fields in a foreign sun while the world decided itself without me. If I spoke, I would confirm their power. If I refused, I would confirm my weakness. There was no honorable choice, only degrees of exposure. I told myself to watch their hands, to listen for mockery, to look for the guards shifting their weight, waiting for the moment when the charade ended and the laughter began. None of that came. They waited. That unsettled me more than shouting would have. America, I was beginning to understand, did not behave the way I expected. The camp itself, Camp Swift, had already violated too many of my assumptions. We were counted fed assigned work. Guards enforced rules, but the rules were consistent, predictable. No sudden punishments, no arbitrary cruelty. I had overheard guards talking about regulations, about inspections, about the Geneva Convention. In Germany, international law had been something you cited when convenient and ignored when it interfered. Here, it seemed to be followed not because anyone loved us, but because it was the rule. Order over revenge. That phrase came to me later, but the principle was already visible. These men did not need to humiliate me to feel victorious. They had fields to tend, crops to save, a war to supply, and yet knowing this did not quiet the fear, because fear is not rational. It is historical. I remembered standing in a courtroom years earlier watching a colleague stripped of his position while the gallery applauded. Not because they hated him, but because they wanted to be seen agreeing. Humiliation had been communal then, shared, sanitized by procedure. This felt uncomfortably similar. I imagined myself speaking carefully legally correctly, only to have one of the farmers laugh and say, "Hear that? The German thinks he's still important." I imagined the other prisoners watching, absorbing the lesson. This is what happens when you forget your place. The stick in my hand felt heavier than it should have. Sweat ran down my spine, slow and deliberate. I was aware of my posture in a way I hated. Shoulders tight, chin lowered, body already bracing for judgment before any had been given. I wanted to refuse, to say I was unqualified, that I was only a laborer now, that I did not understand American land law. But refusal, too, is a statement. It would mean fear had already won. So I told myself something I had not allowed myself to believe in years. Perhaps this is not a trap. Perhaps this is simply what they do. The thought frightened me more than the alternative. If this was genuine, if these men truly expected fairness from an enemy, then everything I had been taught about power was wrong. And if that was true, then the country I had served had not only lost the war, it had lost the argument. I looked at the ditch, at the way the earth dipped almost imperceptibly toward one field rather than the other. I asked questions, my voice steady only because I forced it to be. Where had the water run last spring? Who had maintained the banks? What had been agreed before the war took their sons? As I spoke, no one interrupted. That, too, was terrifying. When I finished listening, there was nothing left but action. No more delay. No more rehearsal of humiliation. I stepped forward, placing myself between the two Americans. My hand shook. I lowered my head not in submission but to hide the tremor. And in that moment, with the sun burning down and the dust clinging to my skin, I understood the true risk. Not that they would humiliate me, but that they might not. And I was no longer sure which outcome frightened me more. They did not rush me. That was the first thing I noticed. No one shouted for an answer. No one told me to hurry up or reminded me that I was a prisoner. The two farmers stood where they were, hats tilted back now, hands resting on hips, waiting as if time itself belonged to them. Somewhere behind us, the line of prisoners had stopped working, but no guard barked at them to move along. Even the cicadas seemed to ease their noise, flattening into a steady, distant hum. I bent and picked up the stick. It felt light in my hand, too light for the weight it suddenly carried. I knelt and pressed its tip into the dirt, the dry earth giving way easily, drawing a line that curved where the ground sloped. The soil was cracked pale on the surface, darker beneath. I traced the ditch as it had once been, following the faint memory of water's path. I asked them to show me where the water ran after heavy rain. The taller farmer stepped forward first, pointing to the way the land dipped toward his field. The other interrupted, insisting the ditch had always favored his side, that his father had dug it decades ago when this land still belonged to one family. They spoke over each other, then caught themselves and fell silent, glancing at me as if remembering why they were there. I asked them to speak one at a time. The words came out before I had time to stop them. Calm. Automatic. The voice I had once used to quiet crowded courtrooms slipped back into place unchanged by years of disuse. To my surprise, they obeyed. I listened. Not just to what they said, but to how they said it. The pauses. The irritation softened by fatigue. The pride tucked beneath complaint. This was not a legal battle. It was a human one. Two men, guarding the last things they felt were still under their control. I drew again in the dirt, marking where runoff would naturally collect, where erosion would pull soil away over time. I asked about repairs made after storms, about who had cleared debris when the ditch overflowed last spring, about the fence posts that had shifted inch by inch with each season. Neither man objected to the questions. One corrected the other, then nodded when the correction was returned. They argued yes, but not angrily now. More like men solving a problem together even as they pretended not to be. I was dimly aware of my own breathing slowing. This was familiar ground, not the field, but the process. Facts before judgment. Listening before decision. I had not realized how deeply I missed it until my body remembered before my mind did. At no point did either farmer remind me that I was German. At no point did either one look toward the guards as if to check whether this was allowed. They treated the moment as if it were ordinary. That, more than anything, unsettled me. When I finished, I stood and brushed the dirt from my knees. The stick hovered in my hand, the final line not yet drawn. I hesitated, not because I did not know what to decide, but because I knew what that decision would mean. In Germany, judgment had long since stopped being about truth. It had become about alignment. About who benefited from an outcome, not whether it was right. Here, in a cotton field in Texas, the old rules seemed to be waiting for me untouched. I drew the last line. The ditch, I said, had shifted naturally with erosion, but responsibility for its maintenance lay with the man whose land it protected most. That meant the boundary favored one side, but not by intent. By neglect. The solution was simple. Restore the ditch along its original slope, shared labor, shared cost. No loss, no victory. Silence followed. The taller farmer squinted at the lines in the dirt. The other crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, chewing on the inside of his cheek. For a long moment I braced myself. This was it, I thought. The laughter. The dismissal. The reminder of who held power. Instead, the first man nodded slowly. "That makes sense," he said. A second let out a breath I had not noticed him holding. "Fair is fair," he muttered. They looked at each other, really looked, the tension easing out of their shoulders. Then without ceremony they stepped forward and shook hands. A firm grip. No hesitation. The dust rose around their boots as if sealing the agreement. No one looked at me. Not right away. The absence of reaction was almost disorienting. There was no applause. No comment about my accent. No joke at my expense. The moment belonged to them, and they seemed content to let it pass as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Only then did one of them turn back toward me. "Appreciate it," he said. Just that. The other nodded once in agreement. That was all. They picked up their hats, returned to their fields, and began discussing when to fix the ditch as neighbors, not adversaries. Their voices faded into the sounds of work swallowed by the land. I stood where I was, the stick still in my hand. Around us, life resumed. Prisoners bent back to their rows. Guards shifted their weight, uninterested. The sun continued its slow descent, indifferent to the small but complete thing that had just occurred. No one laughed. No one pointed. No one reminded me that I wore the clothes of a defeated man. I had expected at the very least to be reduced to have my past paraded briefly before being taken away again. Instead, it had been acknowledged and then set aside like a tool borrowed and returned without comment. This, I realized, was the difference. In the Germany I had known, authority demanded recognition. Here it was used only as long as it was needed and then released. The farmers did not care who I had been, only whether I could help them solve a problem. That, too, was a form of respect. I thought of the town halls I had read about in American newspapers where disputes were settled not by decree, but by conversation. Of juries made of ordinary men. Of laws written plainly, argued openly. I had dismissed those stories once as propaganda of a different sort. Standing there alone in the field outside Camp Swift, I felt something unfamiliar tighten in my chest. Not hope, not yet, but recognition. I had not been judged by my uniform, my nationality, or my defeat. I had been judged by the care with which I listened and the fairness of my answer. Nothing more. As I returned the stick to the ground and stepped back into line, no one blocked my way. No guard escorted me. I simply resumed my place among the others, another man in a row of men, indistinguishable once more, and yet something had shifted. Not in the camp, not in the war, in me. For the first time since my capture, I understood that power did not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it revealed itself quietly by trusting an enemy with justice and expecting him to be worthy of it. I lowered my eyes again, but this time it was not to hide my fear. It was to steady myself, because I knew with a clarity that left me unbalanced that whatever came next would not be able to erase what had just happened. And no one, absolutely no one, had tried to take my dignity away. When they were gone, my legs betrayed me. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just a slow, unmistakable trembling that moved upward from my calves to my hands as if my body had been holding something back and no longer saw a reason to pretend. I stood there for a moment staring at the place where the two farmers had shaken hands, waiting for the feeling to pass. It did not. I turned away before anyone could notice. I did not want help. I did not want questions. I walked toward the edge of the field where a low wooden shed leaned against the wind, its door half open, its interior dark and cool compared to the glare outside. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of old hay and oil wrapped around me, familiar and strangely comforting. That was when my hands began to shake in earnest. Not with fear. Fear had a shape I knew well. It sharpened the senses, narrowed the world, demanded readiness. This was different. This was disorientation. The sudden loss of tension after years of living inside it. I sat down on an upturned crate and pressed my palms together, trying to still them. My breath came shallow at first, then deeper, as if I were relearning how to use my lungs. For a long time I stared at the dirt floor, tracing the lines between cracks with my eyes. They had listened to me. The thought returned again and again, landing with the same quiet force each time. Not tolerated, not humored, listened to. In the field, my words had not been weighed against my accent or my uniform. They had been weighed against reality, against fairness, against the simple question of what was right. I had almost forgotten what that felt like. Images rose unbidden, layered one atop another. A courtroom with high windows and pale walls. Wooden benches polished smooth by generations of restless hands. The smell of ink and paper. I could see myself standing younger than the robe heavy on my shoulders, the room rising when I entered. My father had sat in the back on the day I first presided alone. He had not smiled. That was not his way. But when our eyes met, he had nodded once, slow and deliberate, the way a man does when he believes something important has been done correctly. Law, he had taught me, was not power, it was restraint. My mother had worried that the profession would harden me. She was wrong. It had softened me, taught me patience, taught me to listen longer than was comfortable. Justice, she said, was the art of taking people seriously, even when it was inconvenient. Those lessons had not survived the Reich. At first, the changes were subtle. New statutes, new language, words like security and unity appearing where rights had once stood. We were told it was temporary, necessary, for the good of the nation. Many believed it, others pretended to. Then came the directives we could not reconcile with conscience. Cases reassigned. Decisions reviewed not for legality, but for loyalty. Colleagues removed quietly, then publicly, then violently. The robe became a costume, the courtroom a stage. I remembered the day I realized the law was no longer a shield. A man stood before me accused not of a crime, but of doubt. The evidence was thin, the outcome predetermined. When I hesitated, the clerk cleared his throat and glanced toward the door where two men waited expressionless. I delivered the verdict they wanted. I told myself I had protected myself, that I would do more good alive than ruined. That lie stayed with me longer than I cared to admit. By the time the war began in earnest, there was nothing left to protect. Law had been repurposed into a weapon wielded with precision and indifference. The word order had come to mean obedience. Justice had become a performance emptied of its purpose. And yet, here I was. In a country at war on two fronts, men overseas dying in places whose names I struggled to pronounce, factories churning without rest, families rationing and waiting. And still, in a dusty field in Texas, two farmers had paused their anger long enough to seek fairness from an enemy. The contrast was unbearable. America, fighting for its life, still trusted process, still believed that disputes could be settled without humiliation, that being right mattered more than being dominant, that law could survive even when the world was unraveling. Germany, claiming to defend order, had destroyed the very thing that made order worth preserving. I pressed my fists against my eyes hard enough to see light burst behind the lids. My throat tightened a familiar warning I ignored. I had not cried since my capture, not when I surrendered, not when I boarded the ship, not when I realized I might never see home again. Tears, I had decided, were a luxury for men who still belonged somewhere. They came anyway, not in sobs, not with noise, just a steady release, silent and unstoppable, sliding down my face and soaking into the dust at my feet. I did not wipe them away. There was no one to see, and for once no reason to hide. I cried for the man I had been, for the man I had failed to be, for the country that had taught me law and then betrayed it. But I also cried for something else. Gratitude, sharp and unfamiliar. Those farmers would never know what they had given me. They would not think of it as kindness. To them, it had been ordinary. A disagreement settled, a day's work resumed. They would return home that evening tired, perhaps still annoyed, but at peace with the outcome. They would not write about it. They would not boast. That, too, was part of the difference. In the Reich, every gesture had been recorded, every loyalty displayed, every action measured for its usefulness to the narrative. Here, decency required no witness. As my breathing slowed, another realization took shape, quieter, but no less profound. They had trusted me not because I was German, or in spite of it, but because I was human. That trust had not been earned through force or pleading. It had been assumed, and in being assumed, it had demanded something of me. Integrity, care, responsibility. For years, the law had been something done to people. Today, for a brief moment, it had been something done with them. When the tears finally stopped, I felt emptied and steadied at the same time, like a vessel scrubbed clean. I sat there longer than necessary, letting the cool air of the shed settle against my skin, letting the sounds of work resume outside without my attention. Eventually, I stood and made my way back to the barracks. The others were already there changing shirts, washing dust from their hands, speaking in low voices. No one asked where I had been. No one commented on my face. I lay down on my cot and stared at the wooden slats above me, counting the knots until my thoughts slowed. That night, after lights out, I turned my face toward the wall, and there, in the darkness of a place meant to erase me, I allowed myself to grieve not only for what had been lost, but for what had been unexpectedly returned. For the first time in years, I did not feel like a number. I felt like a man again. The next morning, nothing had changed. That was the part I did not expect. The same bell rang, and the same lines formed, and the same guards counted heads with practiced indifference. Work assignments were read aloud. Tools were handed out. The Texas sun rose on schedule, indifferent to revelations. And yet everything was different. I noticed it in the smallest things first, in the way orders were given without insult, in the way rules were enforced without improvisation, in the way a guard corrected a prisoner not with anger, but with a flat certainty that this was simply how things were done. There was no performance to it, no sense that anyone was trying to prove anything. That was when I began to understand that what I had experienced in the field was not an exception. It was a pattern. America's power, I realized, did not come from moments of mercy delivered by extraordinary men. It came from ordinary behavior repeated so often it no longer felt remarkable. The farmers had not acted kindly because they were unusually generous. They had acted that way because the system they lived in expected it, because fairness was not a virtue to be admired, but a habit to be practiced. Back home, law had been a monument, something invoked, displayed, celebrated in speeches. Here it was infrastructure, like roads, like fences, like water lines that ran whether anyone noticed them or not. As the days passed, I began to see it everywhere. In the way prisoners were paid for their labor, not because we were friends, but because work deserved compensation. In the way camp rules were posted, clearly translated carefully, enforced consistently. In the way complaints were handled, not always resolved, but always heard. Even discipline followed a logic I recognized. Punishment was proportionate, predictable. Boring, even. There was no pleasure in it, no sense of theater. A violation produced a consequence, and then life resumed. In Germany, punishment had been designed to educate through fear. Here, it seemed designed to restore order and move on. That distinction mattered more than I had ever understood. On Sundays, work slowed. The camp grew quieter. Guards gathered in small groups talking about towns and farms and families I would never meet. Sometimes music drifted from a radio, unfamiliar but comforting in its casualness. No one ordered us to listen. No one demanded silence. I thought of my country where every sound had eventually been claimed by the state. The contrast sharpened when news arrived. We heard about factories running day and night, about planes and ships produced faster than they could be used, about towns emptied of young men, yet somehow still functioning, about a country stretched across continents and oceans holding itself together not with fear, but with systems. I had been trained to believe that such a thing was impossible, that only discipline enforced through terror could sustain an empire at war, that kindness was weakness, that law was a luxury reserved for peace. Standing inside this machine, this enormous, imperfect, relentlessly organized machine, I saw the lie for what it was. America did not suspend its values to win the war. It relied on them. The farmers trusted process. The guards trusted rules. The courts trusted procedure. And because they trusted these things, they did not need to constantly assert power. It was already there, embedded in routine. I began to understand something that unsettled me deeply. America did not win because it was cruel enough to crush enemies. It won because it was strong enough to trust its values. That trust extended even to men like me, not because we deserved it, not because we were forgiven, but because the system did not require hatred to function. It required order, fairness, and an almost stubborn faith that people given boundaries would act reasonably. I thought of the Reich again, of its obsession with loyalty and purity, of how much energy had been spent identifying enemies, policing thought-erasing deviation, of how fragile that system had been, how dependent on constant pressure, constant fear. Here, the pressure was different. It came not from above, but from expectation. You were expected to follow the rules because the rules worked, because violating them gained you nothing. This realization did not arrive as a celebration. It arrived as grief. If this was possible, if a nation could fight the largest war in history and still insist on fairness, then everything I had been told about necessity and sacrifice had been false. We had not lost our law because the world was cruel. We had lost it because we chose to. In the evenings after work, I found myself watching the guards more closely. Not with resentment, but with curiosity. They were not saints. Some were bored. Some were impatient. A few were openly hostile. But none of that mattered because the system did not depend on their goodness. It depended on consistency. The same rules applied whether a guard was kind or cruel, tired or alert. That was the difference between a state and a mood. I had spent years believing that justice required virtuous men. America taught me that justice required durable structures. One afternoon, a younger prisoner asked me quietly if I thought the farmers had truly accepted the decision that day, if they would later undo it when no one was watching. I surprised myself by answering without hesitation. Yes, I said, they will. Not because they feared consequences, not because they respected me, but because they respected the outcome. Because fairness once agreed upon became binding. That was the quiet power of it. War, I had learned, reveals what societies truly value. Under pressure, ideals either collapse or become visible. In Germany, pressure had stripped away law and left obedience. In America, pressure had stripped away ceremony and left principle. I began to see my own defeat differently. I had not been conquered by force alone. I had been outmatched by a system that could afford to treat enemies humanely because it was confident in itself. A system that did not need to humiliate in order to assert dominance. This did not make captivity easier. I still longed for home. I still worried about what awaited me there. I still carried the weight of loss and complicity, but it changed the meaning of survival. If justice could exist here, messy, imperfect, but alive, then perhaps it could exist again elsewhere. Not imposed, not proclaimed, but practiced quietly by people who believed it was simply the way things were done. For the first time since the war began, I allowed myself to imagine a future not defined by victory or defeat, a future defined by repair. I did not become an American in that moment. I did not renounce my past or absolve myself of it, but something shifted in how I understood the world. Nationality, I realized, was not the highest claim on a man's conscience. Justice was, humanity was, and those things I now knew could survive even in the hands of an enemy if the enemy trusted them enough to let them live. I did not have the words for it then. I only felt the difference. In 1944, America was loud with machines and quiet with certainty. You could hear the war everywhere on the trains that groaned past the camps at night, on the radios crackling with news from Europe in the absence of young men from farms and town squares. And yet, beneath all of that noise ran something steady and unspoken, a shared understanding. People argued, of course. They always had. About land, about money, about who was right and who was wrong. But they argued inside a frame they trusted. They believed that rules mattered even when they hurt, especially when they hurt. That losing fairly was better than winning by force. That belief did not come from speeches. It came from habit. Factories ran because contracts were honored. Farms survived because neighbors settled disputes without calling the state to crush one another. Courts functioned because verdicts were accepted even by those who disagreed with them. There was friction, but there was also faith that the system, imperfect as it was, belonged to everyone. Looking back now, I wonder how rare that is. The America I saw in 1944 was not innocent. It was segregated, unequal, flawed in ways it had not yet begun to confront. But it was cohesive. It trusted the idea that tomorrow would be built using the same tools as today: law, compromise, shared sacrifice. People believed they were part of something larger than themselves. They did not agree on everything, but they agreed on the ground rules. From where I stand now, decades removed, my own life long finished, that America feels distant. Not vanished, but altered. As if a language once spoken fluently has been replaced by dialects that no longer recognize one another. Today's America is still powerful, still inventive, still capable of astonishing generosity, but it feels suspicious in ways the wartime nation did not. Suspicious of institutions, suspicious of process, suspicious of anyone who claims neutrality. Fairness, once assumed to be a goal, now feels like a position to defend. Justice, once procedural, now feels performative. In 1944, no one asked whether the law favored their side. They asked whether it applied consistently. Today, the first question seems to be who benefits from the outcome, not whether the outcome is right. That shift did not happen all at once. It crept in quietly, the way fear always does. Fear that rules are being used against you. Fear that institutions no longer represent you. Fear that fairness is a mask worn by enemies. I recognize that fear. I have seen where it leads. In Germany, mistrust hollowed out the courts long before the bombs fell. Once people stopped believing that law belonged to everyone, they began to cheer when it was bent against their neighbors. They accepted injustice because it was convenient. By the time they realized what had been lost, there was nothing left to appeal to. America never followed that path in the same way. History is not repetition. It is rhyme. But echoes matter. The farmers in that Texas field did not ask whether I was German or American when they handed me their dispute. They asked whether I could help them reach a fair outcome. They did not need to know my politics. They did not ask for assurances of loyalty. They trusted the process more than they trusted the person. That distinction feels fragile now. Today, outcomes are scrutinized for intent. Motives are assumed. Neutrality itself is treated as a provocation. People speak of justice as something to be won, not something to be done. What was once a shared table has become a battlefield of interpretations, and yet I hesitate to condemn. Every generation inherits pressures the last one did not. The America of 1944 was forged by Depression War and a clarity of threat that left little room for ambiguity. The enemy was visible. The stakes were unmistakable. Unity then was survival. Today's threats are more diffuse, harder to point to, easier to argue over. Suspicion fills the gaps left by certainty. Still, the question remains. At what point did Americans stop trusting fairness to stand on its own? When did due process become something to fear rather than rely upon? When did losing fairly feel worse than winning dishonestly? I do not pretend to know the answers. I am not here to assign blame or nostalgia. The past was not perfect. The present is not hopeless. But I know the systems survive only as long as people are willing to accept outcomes they do not like. Law functions only when it restrains everyone, including those who believe themselves righteous. In 1944, America was strong enough, confident enough to allow even an enemy to participate in justice. Not as a gesture, but as a matter of course. That confidence did not make the nation weak. It made it formidable. Because a society that trusts its rules does not need to shout. It does not need to humiliate. It does not need to prove itself at every turn. It moves forward quietly, expecting others to meet it where it stands. Watching America from the distance of memory. I wonder if that quiet strength has become harder to hear beneath the noise of modern life. Not gone, but crowded out. Perhaps the question is not whether America has changed. Perhaps the question is whether Americans still believe that fairness is something worth trusting even when it does not deliver the outcome they want. I remember that field in Texas not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary, because justice happened without ceremony, and then everyone went back to work. No one filmed it. No one argued about it later. No one questioned whether the wrong man had been listened to. They accepted the result because the process felt right. And standing here now on the far side of history, that memory asks something of the present quietly without accusation. When did we stop trusting fairness? I never met my grandfather. He died before I was born in a country that no longer existed in the form he had known. To me, he was a presence made of fragments, a name on a birth certificate, a photograph of a thin man in a borrowed suit, a few careful sentences my father repeated as if afraid they might break. He did not talk much about the war. When he did, he avoided battles and uniforms. He spoke instead about fields, about heat, about how the dust in Texas was finer than the soil back home. He remembered the sound of insects, the taste of water drawn from a pipe that never seemed to run dry. These details puzzled me as a child. Only later did I understand that memory chooses what the heart needs, not what history demands. Among his papers after he died, we found a folded letter written in English he had learned too late to use professionally. The handwriting was carefully restrained as if each word had been weighed before being allowed onto the page. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. There was no date, just a quiet attempt to leave something behind. He did not apologize. That surprised me. He did not explain his uniform or ask for forgiveness. He did not try to balance guilt or rewrite the past. Instead, he wrote about a day in 1944 when two American farmers asked him to settle a dispute. He described it without drama, as if it were obvious why it mattered. They listened, he wrote. Not because I was right, but because they believed listening was necessary. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. I grew up in a Germany rebuilt from ruins, in a Europe shaped by lessons written in blood. We were taught to remember, to analyze, to confront. We learned dates and numbers and the language of responsibility. But gratitude was never part of the curriculum, and yet gratitude is what my grandfather left behind. Not gratitude for victory or defeat, but for restraint. For the simple decision of strangers not to humiliate a defeated man when they easily could have. For being treated not as a symbol, but as a person whose words might still carry meaning. He returned home after the war, thinner, quieter, altered in the ways my family could not fully name. He did not become a judge again. Perhaps he no longer trusted institutions enough to stand inside them. Perhaps he had learned that justice once broken is slow to forgive those who abandoned it. But he taught his children something else. That power reveals itself most clearly in what it refuses to do. That the strongest nations are not those that punish without limit, but those that know where punishment ends and dignity begins. When I read his letter now, decades later, I hear an echo of an America that existed before I was born, an America of town lines and handshakes of rules that did not require applause. An America confident enough to let an enemy speak without fear of contamination. I know that country was imperfect. All countries are. But it was capable of something rare moral patience. The farmers my grandfather wrote about did not know they were making history. They did not imagine their decision would cross generations. They went home that evening thinking only of work to be done the next day. And yet, in that ordinary act, they shaped how one man understood justice for the rest of his life. That understanding traveled with him across the ocean. It settled into our family, quietly influencing how we spoke about fairness, how we argued, how we listened even when listening was uncomfortable. We did not inherit his guilt. We inherited his gratitude. History remembers who won the war. It catalogs armies and treaties, surrender documents and parades. It debates strategies and assigns blame. All of that matters. But my family remembers something smaller. We remember who trusted my grandfather with justice when they didn't have to. That trust did not absolve him. It did not erase what had happened before. But it reminded him and us that humanity does not belong exclusively to the victorious. Today, when I watch the world struggle with division and certainty erode into suspicion, I think of that field in Texas. Of two men who believed that fairness was still worth practicing even in wartime. Especially in wartime. Their decision asks something of us now, not agreement, not nostalgia, not silence, just a question that refuses to fade. If war came again, would we still be like them?